Welcome to the channel Stories of Slavery. Today we're going back to 1861 to the story of Meline, a black woman who served her master every night to protect her 3 children, doing whatever it took to keep them alive and out of harm's way. This is a difficult and intense story, so take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and write the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. The bedroom door creaked open at exactly 900 every night, and Meline learned to leave her body before her master's hands ever touched her skin. This is the story of a mother who sold her soul in pieces to keep her children whole, and how the first shots of the Civil War would finally set her free. But freedom, as Meline would learn, comes with a price that can take a lifetime to pay. The Beaumont plantation stretched across 200 acres of Virginia tobacco fields in Hanover County, just 15 miles north of Richmond. In the spring of 1861, when Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter, 63 enslaved people worked this land under the ownership of Garrett Beaumont, a 44-year-old widower whose wife had died giving birth to a stillborn son 3 winters prior. The main house rose 3 stories high, white columns gleaming against red brick, a monument to wealth built on stolen labor and broken bodies. Magnolia trees lined the entrance road, their sweet scent mixing with tobacco curing in the barns, creating a perfume that Meline would forever associate with captivity. Meline had arrived at Beaumont Plantation in the fall of 1854, purchased at auction in Richmond for $37,100. She was 19 years old, strong, limb-eyed and clear-eyed, with skin the color of polished mahogany, and hands that could coax bread to rise in any weather. The auctioneer had called her a prime field hand, but Garrett Beaumont saw something else entirely. He bought her before anyone else could raise a paddle. Her 3 children came in quick succession. Josephine in 1856, born in the small cabin behind the smokehouse. Samuel in 1858, delivered during a thunderstorm that knocked out every lamp on the property. And little Clara Ara in 1860, named for Meline's mother, who had been sold away when Meline was 7 years old. 3 children with their father's gray eyes and their mother's determined jaw, living evidence of the arrangement that kept them together. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something about the laws governing enslaved people in Virginia. In 1861, a master held absolute power over his human property. He could sell a child away from its mother on a whim. He could separate a husband from a wife with a signature. There was no court that would hear an enslaved person's complaint, no authority that would intervene. The only protection a mother had was whatever leverage she could create with her own body and her own mind. Meline understood this arithmetic perfectly. The arrangement had begun in the winter of 1855, 6 months after her arrival. Beaumont had summoned her to the main house one evening, ostensibly to discuss her reassignment from field work to the kitchen. The conversation lasted 3 minutes. He told her plainly that he found her attractive. He told her that he could make her life comfortable or miserable depending on her cooperation. And he told her that any children she bore would remain with her on the plantation, never sold, as long as she came to him, willingly, whenever he called. Willingly. The word still tasted like ash in her mouth 6 years later. That first night, Meline walked from her cabin to the main house through a January freeze that turned her breath to clouds. She climbed the back stairs to the master's bedroom on the 2nd floor, where a fire burned in the hearth and clean sheets covered the Forester bed. Beaumont was waiting in a silk robe, a glass of brandy in his hand, playing the gentleman host as if this were a social call rather than a transaction. She learned to go somewhere else inside her head, to a river she remembered from childhood, cool water rushing over smooth stones, to her mother's voice singing hymns in the evening, to a future she could barely imagine, but clung to anyway. A someday when her children would be free, and she could stop paying for their safety with her flesh. The other enslaved people on the plantation knew. Of course, they always knew. Some judged her harshly, calling her the master's fancy woman behind her back, as if she had chosen this path rather than being forced down it. Others understood. Old Harriet, who cooked in the main house and had seen 3 of her own children sold south, never said a word of criticism. She just left extra food outside Meline's cabin door and taught her the herbs that could prevent unwanted pregnancies. Though those remedies had failed 3 times. 3 beautiful failures that Meline loved more than her own life. Josephine, at 5 years old, was already showing signs of her mother's intelligence. She could count to 100, knew her letters from watching Meline trace them in the dirt, and asked questions that no enslaved child should be smart enough to ask. Why do we live in cabins while they live in the big house? Why does Mama go away at night? Why does Mr. Beaumont look at us like we belong to him? Because we do, baby. Because we do. Samuel, at 3, was all energy and mischief, forever climbing trees and chasing chickens, his laughter ringing across the quarters like church bells. He had no idea yet what his gray eyes meant, what story they told about his parentage. He just knew that his mama held him tight every morning, and that the white man in the big house sometimes gave him peppermint candies. Clara Ara, at 1 year old, was still nursing, still innocent of everything except hunger and comfort. She had Meline's smile, wide and warm, appearing like sunrise whenever her mother's face came into view. For these 3 hearts, Meline would endure anything. The spring of 1861 brought more than just azalea blossoms to Hanover County. News of Fort Sumter spread through Virginia like wildfire, and suddenly the word everyone whispered was war. White men gathered in the Beaumont parlor to discuss secession, their voices carrying through walls that enslaved ears had long learned to penetrate. Meline served coffee and cake at these meetings, her face blank as fresh paper, while her mind recorded every word. Virginia will join the Confederacy by month's end, one planter declared, and then we'll show those Yankees what Southern men are made of. Meline carried the tray back to the kitchen, her hand steady even as her heart raced. War meant chaos. Chaos meant opportunity. For the first time in 6 years, she allowed herself to think about running. But running with 3 children, one of them still at the breast, was nearly impossible. The Underground Railroad route she'd heard whispered about required speed and silence. A crying baby could get an entire group captured. A 5-year-old's tired legs could slow them enough for the patrollers to catch up. The mathematics of escape didn't add up no matter how many times Meline calculated. Still, she began to prepare. She hid food in small amounts, dried meat and hardtack that wouldn't spoil. She stole a map from Beaumont's study during one of her nightly visits, memorizing its lines before returning it to the drawer. She asked careful questions of the house servants, who had contact with free black people in Richmond, learning which roads were watched and which might offer passage north. April turned to May, and Virginia officially seceded from the Union. The Beaumont plantation transformed almost overnight. Young white men who had supervised the tobacco fields enlisted in the Confederate Army, leaving gaps in the surveillance system that had kept enslaved people trapped. Beaumont himself was too old for combat, but contributed generously to the war effort, sending supplies and money to Richmond, while complaining about the disruption to his business. The nightly summons continued without interruption. War or no war, Beaumont's appetites remained constant. On the night of May 23, 1861, Meline climbed those back stairs, as she had hundreds of times before. But something was different. Beaumont was drunk more than usual and angry about something she didn't understand. His hands were rougher than they'd ever been. His words were crueler. And when it was over, he said something that turned her blood to ice. "I've had an offer for the boy. Plantation down in Alabama needs young bucks to train up. Good price, too." Meline couldn't breathe. The boy, Samuel, her 3-year-old son with gray eyes and a laugh like church bells. "You promised," she whispered, forgetting her place, forgetting everything except the terror clawing at her chest. "You promised they would never be sold." Beaumont laughed, the sound mean and wet with whiskey. "Promises to a slave. Woman, you don't understand how this works. I've kept them this long because it suited me, but money's tight with the war and a promise doesn't pay debts." She felt herself falling even though she was standing still. 6 years. 6 years. She had given him everything he wanted, endured every touch, swallowed every humiliation, and he could break his word with a sentence. "Please." The word came out broken. "Please, I'll do anything." "You already do everything." Beaumont stretched out on the bed, dismissing her. "Go back to your cabin." "I haven't decided yet." Meline walked down those stairs on legs that didn't feel like her own. The night air hit her face, but she couldn't feel it. The stars overhead might as well have been painted on a ceiling for all they mattered. Her son, her baby boy. Alabama was a death sentence for a child his age, worked in cotton fields until his small body gave out or sold again to someone even crueler. She had 1 week, she learned, the next day. The buyer from Alabama would arrive on May 30th to inspect the property, including any enslaved people Beaumont wanted to sell. 7 days to find a way to save her son. The answer came from an unexpected source. Old Harriet, who cooked in the main house, pulled Meline aside in the kitchen garden 3 days before the buyer was scheduled to arrive. "There's a way north," Harriet whispered, her eyes scanning for observers. "A man named Solomon, free black out of Richmond, runs a route through the swamps. Leaves from the old Miller farm every new moon." The new moon was June 1st, 2 days after the buyer would arrive. "I can't wait that long," Meline said. "He's selling Samuel on the 30th. Then you need to make sure that sale doesn't happen." "How?" Harriet pressed something into Molly's hand. A small bottle, amber glass no bigger than her thumb. "This came from a root woman in the quarters at Twaho Plantation. It won't kill him, but it'll make him sick enough to delay any business. Put it in his evening brandy. The buyer won't stay to negotiate with a man who can't get out of bed." Meline stared at the bottle. Poison or something like it. The line she had refused to cross for 6 years, suddenly the only line that mattered. "What about after?" she asked. "He'll know it was me. After you'll be gone. Solomon's route can take all of you, if you're at the Miller farm by midnight on June 1st. I've already sent word." The weight of the bottle was nothing. The weight of the choice was everything. She thought of Josephine's questions. She thought of Samuel's laughter. She thought of Clara Ara's sunrise smile. She thought of every night climbing those stairs, every morning washing away the evidence, every hour of every day pretending that this life was survivable. Seemed to match the turmoil in Molly's heart. She served dinner that evening, moving between the dining room and kitchen with practiced invisibility. The buyer, a man named Crawford with tobacco, stained teeth and small, greedy eyes, talked about his plantation's need for young laborers. He talked about Samuel like he was livestock, assessing the boy's potential for work, speculating about how much cotton a child his age could pick once properly trained. Molly poured brandy with hands that didn't shake. She had added Harriet's potion to the decanter an hour earlier. mixing it thoroughly so no trace remained visible. Now she watched Beaumont and Crawford raise their glasses in a toast to profitable business. By midnight, both men were violently ill. The household doctor was summoned from Richmond, arriving at dawn to find his patients writhing with stomach cramps and fever. His diagnosis was food poisoning, likely from the oysters served at dinner. The sale would have to be postponed until both men recovered. Meline allowed herself one moment of relief before the fear returned. She had bought time, but not much. And Beaumont, even in his sickness, watched her with suspicious eyes whenever she entered his bedroom to bring broth or change his sheets. Does he know? She wondered constantly. Does he suspect? The answer came on the evening of May 31st, less than 24 hours before Solomon's route would open. Molly was carrying a tray to Beaumont's bedroom when she heard voices inside. She paused outside the door, listening through the crack. The root woman at Tuckahoe, Beaumont was saying, his voice weak but clear. I've heard she sells potions to slaves who want to hurt their masters. Crawford's man recognized the symptoms. Someone poisoned us deliberately. We should question the kitchen staff. Another voice responded. The overseer, a man named Tate, who had returned from military training when the regular supervisors enlisted. Start with the one who served the brandy. Beaumont said. Start with Molly. The tray in Molly's hands began to shake. She set it down silently on the hallway floor and crept back down the stairs, her mind racing faster than her feet. They knew. They didn't have proof yet, but they knew. By morning, Tate would come for her. He would use whatever methods necessary to extract a confession. And then her children would watch their mother hang from the oak tree where Beaumont conducted his punishments. She had hours, not days. And the route to freedom didn't open until tomorrow night. In the quarters, Meline found Harriet waiting outside her cabin. The old woman's face told her everything. They're coming at first light, Harriet said. Tate told the house staff to be ready for a questioning. I have to run tonight. Solomon's not at the Miller farm until tomorrow. Then I'll hide until he arrives. Meline was already gathering her children. Shaking Josephine awake, lifting Samuel from his pallet, strapping Clara to her chest with a length of cloth. I can't be here when Tate comes. Harriet pressed a bundle into her hands, food, a knife, a tinder box. The swamp path starts behind the old tobacco barn. Follow the creek north until you hit the river, then go west. The Miller farm is 3 miles past the first bridge. Meline hugged the old woman who had been more mother to her than anyone since her own was sold away. Come with us, she whispered. Too old, Harriet replied. Too slow. I'd only get you caught. Now go, child. Go. And don't look back. The night was moonless, clouds covering even the stars. Meline carried Clara against her chest and held Samuel's hand, while Josephine walked beside her, the 5-year-old's face tight with fear and confusion. Where are we going, Mama? Somewhere safe, baby. Somewhere free. The word tasted different in the darkness. Not like ash anymore, like water, like air, like something she might actually be able to swallow. The swamp behind the tobacco barn was a maze of cypress trees and standing water, home to snakes and alligators and whatever else lived in places that humans avoided. Meline had heard stories of runaways who entered these swamps and never emerged. Their bones scattered by animals, their names forgotten by everyone except the mothers who had birthed them. She entered anyway. Samuel whimpered at the cold water seeping into his shoes. Josephine bit her lip hard enough to draw blood, refusing to cry out even when branches scratched her face. Clara blessedly slept against Meline's heart, her breathing soft and steady. They walked for hours, following the creek as Harriet had instructed. The water rose to Mali's waist in places, forcing her to lift Samuel above her head while Josephine clung to her skirt. Torchaged snorts at tor. Insects swarmed thick enough to breathe. The darkness was absolute, navigated only by touch and faith. Near dawn, they found a hollow cypress trunk large enough to shelter all four of them. Molly crawled inside with her children, pulling branches across the opening to hide their presence. "We'll rest here today," she whispered to Josephine. "Tonight we walk again." "Are the bad men coming, Mama?" "Maybe, but we're going to be faster. We're going to be smarter. And we're going to be free." Josephine's gray eyes, so like her father's, studied Mally's face in the dim light filtering through the branches. "What's free?" The question hung in the humid air. Molly thought of all the ways she could answer. Freedom was not climbing stairs to a bedroom where she didn't want to be. Freedom was not watching buyers inspect her children like cattle. Freedom was not holding her tongue when every word wanted to be a scream. "Free is when we belong to ourselves," she finally said. "When no one can sell us or hurt us or tell us what to do. When Mama doesn't have to leave at night and you don't have to ask why." Josephine considered this for a long moment. Then she nestled against her mother's side and closed her eyes. "I want to be free," she murmured as sleep took her. "So do I, baby, so do I." The day passed in fragments of sleep and terror. Every sound became potential discovery. Every bird call might be a signal. Every rustle in the underbrush could be dogs on their trail. Molly kept her knife in her hand, though she wasn't sure what she would do with it if they were found. Could she kill a man to protect her children? Could she kill herself to avoid being taken back? The questions had no answers. There was only waiting and praying and holding her babies close while the sun traced its arc overhead. By late afternoon, the search party found their trail. Molly heard the dogs first, their baying echoing through the swamp from somewhere to the south. Then the shouts of men calling to each other, coordinating their hunt with the efficiency of practice. The Beaumont plantation had conducted many such searches over the years. The men knew this swamp. They knew its paths and its hiding places. They would find the hollow cypress eventually. Molly made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She kissed each of her children's faces, memorizing their features in case she never saw them again. Then she crawled out of the hiding place and began walking south toward the dogs. "Mama!" Josephine's voice sharp with panic. "Stay hidden," Mally commanded in a voice she barely recognized. "Stay absolutely still and silent until the men are gone. Then follow the creek north to the river. A man named Solomon will help you. Tell him your mama sent you. Tell him she paid the price already." She didn't look back. Looking back would break her. The dogs found her within the hour. She had run through water and doubled back on her trail, buying time, leading the search away from the hollow cypress. When Tate and his men caught up to her, she was standing in a clearing, arms raised, face blank as fresh paper. "Where are the children?" Tate demanded. "Gone. Sold them to a trader heading west. The money's already spent." Tate struck her across the face hard enough to send her sprawling into the mud. Meline tasted blood but didn't cry out. Every moment they spent questioning her was a moment her children moved farther away. The interrogation lasted 3 hours. Tate used his fists, a willow switch, and threats that grew increasingly creative. Molly gave them nothing but lies. The children were sold. The children had run with their father, a field hand from a neighboring plantation. The children had drowned in the swamp trying to cross. By the time Tate finally believed that she didn't know where they were, night had fallen. The swamp was too dangerous to search in darkness. The men would resume looking at dawn. They dragged Molly back to the Beaumont plantation and locked her in the smokehouse, hands bound behind her back. A guard posted at the door. Beaumont was still too sick to supervise her punishment personally, but he sent word through Tate. Tomorrow she would hang from the punishment oak. Her body would be left there for 3 days, as a warning to others. Molly sat in the darkness of the smokehouse, surrounded by hanging hams and the smell of old smoke, and smiled for the first time in 6 years. Her children were free. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever price she paid with her body or her life, her children were somewhere in that swamp moving north, toward a man named Solomon, and a future she could barely imagine, but had finally made possible. The night passed slowly. Meline drifted in and out of consciousness, her injuries throbbing with each heartbeat. She dreamed of the river she remembered from childhood, cool water rushing over smooth stones. She dreamed of her mother's voice singing hymns in the evening. She dreamed of Josephine and Samuel and Clara grown and free, living lives that would never require them to climb stairs to bedrooms where they didn't want to be. Dawn came gray and heavy with the promise of rain. The guard unlocked the smokehouse door and dragged Molly into the yard, where a crowd had gathered. Enslaved people from the quarters forced to watch as a lesson. House servants' faces carefully blank. Tate and his men, rope already coiled and ready, and Garrett Beaumont, pale and unsteady from his illness, but determined to see justice done. "You thought you could poison me and steal my property," he said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "You thought wrong." Meline looked at him. This man who had owned her body for 6 years, who had fathered her children and threatened to sell them, who held power so absolute that her life or death was entirely his decision, and she laughed. The sound was wild and broken and free. It echoed off the walls of the big house and scattered birds from the magnolia trees. It made Beaumont's face twist with confusion and rage. "I didn't steal anything," Meline said when she could breathe again. "They were never your property. They were always mine." She was still laughing when the noose went around her neck. The Price of 3 Hearts, Part 2. The rope bit into Molly's neck as Tate's men hauled her onto the wooden platform beneath the punishment oak. She could feel the rough fibers pressing against her windpipe, smell the hemp mixed with old fear from all the bodies that had hung here before her. Above, the branches spread like fingers reaching for a heaven that had never seemed further away. But before Tate could kick the platform from beneath her feet, the sound of horses thundered up the entrance road. 3 riders in Confederate gray burst through the magnolia trees, their mounts lathered and wild-eyed. The lead rider, a young lieutenant barely old enough to shave, pulled up short in the yard, taking in the scene with obvious confusion. "Garrett Beaumont," he called out. "By order of General Lee, all able-bodied men are to report to Richmond immediately. The Yankees are advancing." Beaumont stepped forward, his face shifting from execution to war in an instant. "What's happened?" "Fighting at Big Bethel. The Union forces are moving faster than we expected. We need every man who can hold a rifle." The lieutenant's eyes swept across the assembled crowd, calculating. His gaze lingered on Tate and the other overseers, men young and strong enough for combat. These men, too, were conscripting plantation supervisors by emergency order. Tate released the rope in his hands. Meline swayed on the platform, the noose still around her neck but no longer pulling tight. "What about her?" Beaumont gestured at Meline with evident frustration. "She's a runaway, a poisoner. She tried to kill me." The lieutenant barely glanced in her direction. "Deal with your slaves on your own time. Right now the Confederacy needs soldiers more than it needs hangings. You have 1 hour to prepare." The yard erupted into chaos. Tate began shouting orders to gather supplies. Beaumont retreated to the big house to dress for travel. The enslaved people stood frozen, unsure whether to disperse or remain. No one remembered to remove the noose from Molly's neck. She stood on that platform for 20 minutes, while men rushed around her, invisible again, just as she had been for 6 years. Finally, old Harriet climbed up beside her and loosened the rope with shaking fingers. "Lord works in mysterious ways," Harriet whispered. Molly couldn't speak. Her throat was bruised, her voice reduced to a rasp, but her eyes tracked Beaumont as he emerged from the big house in a tailored uniform, climbing onto a horse that someone had saddled for him. He rode past the punishment oak without looking at her. His mind was already in Richmond, already at war, already calculating how this conflict might affect his tobacco profits. The woman he had summoned to his bed for 6 years, the woman he had been moments away from killing, didn't warrant a final glance. The conscription party rode out, within the hour taking Beaumont, Tate, and 4 other overseers. They left behind a plantation suddenly stripped of white authority, staffed only by Beaumont's elderly mother and a 12-year-old nephew who had been visiting for the summer. That night Molly slipped away again. Her injuries slowed her, each step sending fire through her bruised body. But she followed the same path through the swamp, retracing her route from the night, before praying that her children had followed her instructions. The hollow cypress was empty. She found the trail they had left, small footprints in the mud heading north. She followed it for 2 miles until she reached the river, then turned west as Harriet had instructed. The Miller farm appeared through the trees just after midnight, a decrepit tobacco operation that had been abandoned years earlier. And there, waiting in the shadows of the collapsed barn, stood a tall black man with silver threading his hair and a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. "Solomon," Molly breathed. He studied her for a long moment, taking in the rope burns on her neck, the blood on her clothes, the desperation in her eyes. "Your children made it," he said finally. "Crossed them over to the Patterson station 6 hours ago. They're asking for their mama." The sound that came from Molly's chest was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. It was something older, more primal. The sound of a woman who had been holding herself together with nothing but will, and was finally allowed to fall apart. Solomon caught her before she hit the ground. The Underground Railroad moved Molly north through a network of safe houses and secret routes that had been operating for decades. She traveled in wagon compartments hidden beneath false floors. She slept in barns and church basements and the homes of Quakers who risked everything to help strangers find freedom. She ate what she was given, walked when she was told to walk, hid when she was told to hide, and at every station she asked the same question. "My children? Where are my children?" The answers came in fragments. They were seen in Petersburg. They crossed into Maryland last Tuesday. A woman matching Josephine's description was spotted in Philadelphia. Always ahead, always just out of reach. Molly pushed herself beyond exhaustion, beyond injury, beyond any reasonable limit of human endurance. She had not survived 6 years of selling her body to lose her children. Now she had not stood on a hanging platform to let freedom separate her from the 3 hearts. She had sacrificed everything to protect. The reunion happened in a church basement in Lancaster, Pennsylvania on June 23, 1861. Molly descended the stairs to find Josephine sitting on a wooden bench, Samuel asleep in her lap, Clara fussing in the arms of a Quaker woman who had been tending them. "Mama." Josephine's voice cracked on the word. The 5-year-old who had bitten her lip hard enough to draw blood rather than cry out in the swamp, who had led her younger siblings through the darkness, following nothing but their mother's instructions, who had told Solomon that her mama would come, because her mama always came. finally allowed herself to be a child again. Molly gathered all three of them in her arms and held on until her muscles screamed and her tears soaked their hair, and the Quaker woman quietly excused herself to give them privacy. "I told you," Molly whispered against Josephine's forehead. "I told you I would find you." They stayed in Pennsylvania for 3 months, sheltered by a free black community in Lancaster that had experience protecting runaways. Molly worked in a laundry during the days and spent every evening with her children, teaching them the things she had never been allowed to teach them before. Letters, numbers, their own worth as human beings. The war consumed everything that summer and fall. News came from the South in fragments, battles won and lost, plantations burning, enslaved people fleeing by the thousands toward Union lines. Meline listened to every report, searching for word of the Beaumont plantation, wondering if Garrett Beaumont had survived his military service, wondering if old Harriet had found her own path to freedom. The answers came in October, delivered by a newly escaped man who had passed through Hanover County on his way north. "Beaumont's dead," the man reported. "Took a bullet at Manassas. His mother sold off most of the slaves to pay debts before she died of fever. The old cook, Harriet, she made it to Union lines at Fort Monroe. She's working in a contraband camp now." Molly received this news in silence. She had expected to feel something at the confirmation of Beaumont's death. Satisfaction, perhaps, or relief, or the closure that was supposed to come when your tormentor could never hurt you again. Instead, she felt nothing. Beaumont had been dead to her since the moment she walked away from the hollow cypress. His physical death was merely a formality. The harder death was the one happening inside her own chest. Freedom, Meline discovered, was not the end of suffering. It was the beginning of a different kind of pain. The pain of having time to feel what she had buried for 6 years. The pain of watching her children struggle to understand a world where they were no longer property. The pain of looking in the mirror and seeing a woman she barely recognized, aged beyond her years, marked by experiences that no one who hadn't lived them could possibly understand. Josephine had nightmares. Samuel flinched whenever a white man raised his voice. Clara, too young to remember anything, cried for reasons the doctors could not explain, and only her mother's arms could soothe. They were free. They were together, and they were all, in their own ways, broken. The winter of 1861 brought snow to Lancaster, and a decision that Meline had been avoiding for months. Canada was safer than Pennsylvania. The Fugitive Slave Act still applied here. And though the war made enforcement difficult, hunters still operated for masters willing to pay. Across the border, no American law could reach them. But Canada meant starting over again. New country, new language in some places, new distance from everything and everyone Meline had ever known. The children had finally stopped asking about Virginia. Josephine had made friends at the church school. Samuel had discovered a talent for drawing, filling scraps of paper with images of birds and trees and faces. Clara was walking now, her first steps taken in a house where no one owned her. How could Meline uproot them again? The question answered itself in February, when a stranger appeared at the laundry where Meline worked. A white man with a document in his hand and 2 armed companions at his back. Looking for a runaway, he announced. Negro woman about 26. 3 children, goes by Meline, property of the Beaumont estate. Meline was in the back room, hidden from view, when the laundry owner denied any knowledge of such a person, but she heard every word. She saw the sketch the man was carrying, a rough approximation of her face drawn from description. She understood that Beaumont might be dead, but his estate still owned her on paper, and someone had hired hunters to reclaim what remained of his human property. They left Canada that night. The journey north was colder and harder than the swamp crossing had been. Snow fell thick enough to blind. Temperatures dropped low enough to kill. Meline carried Clara Era against her chest and held Samuel's hand while Josephine walked beside her. The 7-year-old now birthday passed uncelebrated on the road. Conductors on the Underground Railroad moved them from station to station with increasing urgency. Word had spread about the hunters. Other runaways were being targeted. The brief window of chaos that the war had created was closing as both sides organized their efforts. But Canada remained beyond reach for anyone with determination and luck. They crossed the border at Niagara Falls on March 7, 1862. Meline stood on the Canadian side, her children pressed against her legs, staring at the water that tumbled endlessly between two nations. Free. They were actually legally, permanently free. The word still tasted strange, like a language she was learning to speak. The years that followed were harder than any story of freedom usually tells. Meline worked as a domestic servant in St. Catharines, Ontario, one of the many communities where formerly enslaved Americans had built new lives. The pay was poor. The work was familiar. The white Canadians who employed her were sometimes kind and sometimes not. Their prejudices different in flavor, but similar in effect. But she went home to her own cabin every night. She held her own children. She kept every cent she earned. The small victories accumulated. Josephine learned to read fluently, and then to write, her letters forming on paper with a precision that her mother envied. Samuel's drawings caught the attention of a local minister who arranged for art lessons. Clara grew into a serious child, quieter than her siblings, with eyes that seemed to carry memories she was too young to have formed. And Meline began slowly to reclaim the self she had surrendered in Virginia. It started with small things. She cut her hair, which she had kept long because Beaumont preferred it that way. She started attending church again, sitting in pews rather than serving in kitchens. She told her children stories about their grandmother, sold away so many years ago, making sure the family memory survived, even when the family itself had been scattered. She never told them about the arrangement. Some truths were too heavy for children to carry, but Josephine figured it out eventually. At 12 years old, she asked the question that Meline had been dreading since they crossed the border. "Mama, why do Samuel and Clara and I have gray eyes?" They were sitting on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset over Lake Ontario. The water caught the fading light and threw it back in colors that didn't exist anywhere else. Meline considered lying. She had become an expert at lies over the years, at half-truths and misdirection that protected the people she loved. But Josephine deserved better than that. Josephine, who had led her siblings through a swamp in the darkness. Josephine, who had never cried out even when the branches cut her face. Josephine, who had grown up too fast and carried burdens no child should have to carry. "Because your father was a white man," Meline said quietly. "A man who owned me?" The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of waves and distant birds. "Did you love him?" "No." "Did he hurt you?" Meline thought about the nightly summons, the climb up the back stairs, the way she had learned to leave her body before his hands ever touched her skin. "Yes," she said. "But I survived, and so did you." Josephine's hand found her mother's in the darkness. "I hate him. I know. I want to hurt him like he hurt you. He's dead, baby. The war killed him." "Good." The venom in her daughter's voice should have disturbed Meline. Instead, it felt like justice. Like the anger she had never allowed herself to express, finally finding a voice in the next generation. "But hate will eat you alive if you let it," Meline continued. "I learned that in Virginia. I spent years hating everyone and everything, and it almost destroyed me. The only thing that kept me whole was loving you. Loving your brother and sister. Channeling all that rage into something worth fighting for. Josephine was quiet for a long time. The stars came out one by one, the same stars that had watched over their escape through the swamp. What do I do with the anger then? Use it, Meline said. Turn it into fuel. Get educated, get strong. Build a life so beautiful that every person who ever tried to own us has to look up at it from whatever hell they're burning in. The words sounded braver than Meline felt. But she had learned that motherhood sometimes required performing a strength she didn't possess, trusting that the performance would eventually become real. The Civil War ended in April 1865. News of Lee's surrender reached St. Catherine's on a spring morning that smelled of apple blossoms and fresh possibility. Meline stood in the town square with hundreds of others, black and white, listening to the announcement that slavery was officially, constitutionally, permanently abolished in the United States. Around her, people wept and cheered and embraced. Strangers became family in the shared joy of a moment that had seemed impossible for so long. But Meline felt something unexpected. Not joy, not relief, something closer to grief. 4 million people had been enslaved when the war began. How many had died before this day? How many mothers had lost children? How many women had climbed stairs to bedrooms where they didn't want to be, making the same calculations Meline had made, paying the same price, and now it was over. The system that had shaped her entire existence, the system she had fought and fled and survived, was legally dead. What did that make her? A survivor, a victim, a warrior, or just a woman standing in a town square, surrounded by celebrating strangers, wondering who she was supposed to be now that the battle was over. The years after the war brought changes that Meline observed from a careful distance. Black Americans gained citizenship, voting rights, the theoretical protection of a constitution that had once counted them as $3.05 of a person. Some former slaves returned to the South, searching for family members, sold away before the war. Others headed west looking for land and opportunity. A few achieved remarkable success, becoming business owners and politicians, and leaders in communities that had once denied their humanity. Meline stayed in Canada. She had built a life here. Her children had grown into people she was proud of. Josephine became a teacher, educating black children whose parents had escaped the same horror she had. Samuel's art gained recognition in Toronto galleries, his paintings of landscapes and faces selling to collectors who never knew the hands that created them had once been property. Clara Ara, the quiet one, studied medicine and became one of the first black women doctors in Ontario, healing bodies with the same determination her mother had used to free them. Meline watched her children succeed and felt something that took her years to identify. Not pride exactly, not even happiness. It was completion. The sense that the sacrifice had been worth it. That the price she paid on those back stairs in Virginia had purchased something of infinite value. In 1887, at the age of 52, Meline finally told her children the full story. They sat in the parlor of Josephine's house in Toronto, 3 grown adults and their aging mother, while Meline spoke about things she had never spoken about before. The arrangement, the nightly summons, the calculation she had made as a 20-year-old mother, deciding that her body was worth trading for her children's safety, the 6 years of endurance that had made their existence possible. When she finished, the silence was absolute. Then Clara Ara, the doctor, the healer, the child who had been too young to remember anything, rose from her chair and knelt beside her mother. "You saved us," she said simply. "Everything we are, everything we've become exists because you chose to survive. Josephine was crying. Samuel had turned away, his artist's eye unable to witness what his heart was feeling. But Meline looked at her youngest daughter, the one who had crossed the swamp strapped to her chest, the one who had taken her first steps in freedom and finally allowed herself to accept something she had been denying for 26 years. She had not sold her soul, she had invested it. Every moment of those 6 years, every climb up those stairs, every piece of herself she had surrendered had been a deposit into a future she could barely imagine. And now that future was kneeling before her, whole and healed and free. The interest had finally come due. Meline died in 1901, surrounded by grandchildren who knew her only as a quiet woman with sad eyes and gentle hands. Josephine had told them stories, carefully edited versions of their grandmother's journey, from slavery to freedom. Samuel had painted her portrait hanging now in the Toronto Historical Society. Clara Ara had written down everything documenting the oral history before it could be lost. But the full truth stayed within the family. Some stories are too heavy for strangers to carry. On the day of Meline's funeral, Josephine found a letter in her mother's belongings. It was addressed to no one, dated 1885, written in handwriting that had grown shaky with age. "My children," it began, "by the time you read this, I will be gone. But I want you to understand something I could never say out loud. I do not regret what I did in Virginia. I do not regret the nights or the shame or the price I paid. I regret only that the world required such payment, that mothers had to choose between their bodies and their children, that survival demanded transactions no human being should have to make. You are my greatest accomplishment, not because of what you have achieved, though that makes me proud beyond words, but because you exist, because you breathe and love and dream, because every night I climbed those stairs, I was climbing toward you. Remember me as a mother who loved you. Remember me as a woman who chose survival over surrender. And if you ever face an impossible choice, if you ever stand at a crossroads where every path leads to pain, remember that the price of love is always worth paying. Always. Your Mama." Josephine read the letter aloud at the funeral. The words hung in the spring air like the magnolia blossoms Meline had never stopped smelling in her dreams. And somewhere in whatever place the free finally find rest, a woman who had learned to leave her body before her master's hands touched her skin finally fully returned home. The bedroom door that had opened at 900 every night stayed closed forever. The stairs that led to sacrifice led now to a heaven that smelled nothing like tobacco and everything like the cool river water of childhood. Meline was free. She had always been free. She just hadn't known it yet. Some chains are made of iron, others are made of choices. Meline carried both kinds, and in carrying them, she broke them. Not with violence, not with poison, but with something far more powerful. A love so fierce that it could survive anything, even freedom. Even the price that freedom demands. The 3 hearts she protected grew into 6, then 12, then more. A lineage of free people spreading across a continent that had once tried to own them. Her grandchildren's grandchildren would become lawyers and artists and activists, each of them carrying a piece of Meline's determination in their blood. None of them would ever climb stairs to a bedroom where they didn't want to be. That was the inheritance she left them. That was the price of 3 hearts finally fully paid. If you found meaning in Meline's story, take a moment to consider the millions of women whose names we'll never know. Women who made the same impossible choices. Women who paid the same terrible prices. Women whose stories were never written down, but whose descendants walk among us today, free because their ancestors refused to let slavery have the final word. The next story is even harder to tell. Subscribe before it drops.